Well, good morning, brethren. It's delightful to be here. It's delightful to see all of you. My wife and I always look forward in a very special way to being back down here with all of you, and I'm really glad that it worked out. I had a chance to see and talk with most of you right here before services, but we'll look forward to sticking around and visiting for a little bit afterward as well. Things have been going well in the work overall. We have, seems like I've been on the go a fair amount, which that seems like that, every time I think it's about to slow down, something else comes up. 3 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be with brethren in Puerto Rico. You may wonder, what in the world were you doing in Puerto Rico? Puerto Rico is pastored out of Florida and is the furthest extent of our southern region. So I had actually sort of come through here on the way through the week, and I had meetings in, I guess, Houston on Monday, and was over in Baton Rouge Tuesday afternoon, and in Mobile, Alabama with Mr. Hall on Wednesday, and with the deacons and elders there in the Tampa, Florida area on Thursday evening, and then I flew out to Puerto Rico from there on Friday. And it's sort of an unusual experience because as we were singing the hymns, I thought about it. You see, 3 weeks ago, when we were singing the hymns, we were all singing to the same tune. The books looked very similar, at least the cover of them did. The difference was they were all singing in Spanish and I was singing in English. It was the same message and it was the same tune, but we were singing different words. Most of the brethren there speak English well enough. I think there were only about 3 that used headphones for to get translation of my sermon. But anyway, it was very nice to be down there. First opportunity I've had to be there in Puerto Rico. So anyway, things overall seem to be going well. We have had encouraging growth in many of the areas. The southern region that I have responsibility for, we have 8 full-time ministers and pastors that are serving in the southern region, which stretches across from South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. And we have 8 full-time pastors serving in that area, as well as over 30 local elders and many others, deacons and other individuals who serve in many of our churches and video groups. We have an average attendance on a Sabbath across the southern region of somewhere about 1,300. So anyway, give you a little bit of what's going on in that regard. We have a couple of things, of course, this spring transfers that are impacting our region here and in Florida. We overall, in terms of the work in general, things seem to be going well. We've been excited up in East Texas because we've been having increasing growth up there, and we're seeing some of those things that have been very encouraging, and particularly in the Dallas and Gladewater areas that I'm more directly involved in, but also in Arkansas and Mississippi, the Little Rock area in particular. We had public Bible lectures in Little Rock and in Jackson, Mississippi. I was in Little Rock in November and Jackson in December, and we've had new people who've started attending as a result of that. We've had good television coverage there, which certainly makes a difference. I'm going to be leaving from here on my way out to Charlotte. We're going to have a Council of Elders meeting the latter part of the week, and then the General Ministerial Conference beginning Monday, a week from this coming Monday. So I'll be out there for that, and then going directly back home to East Texas. Many of you may be aware that Mr. Carl McNair has fallen and had some injuries, and he is evidently going to be unable to make the trip to Charlotte for the conference. He writes here in the update, currently I've had to walk with crutches or a walker in the house and going to and from the car, and someone assists me in every case. So he says that he is progressing. He is not, at one time he was in continual pain. That's no longer the case. Anyway, he, I know, would appreciate your prayers. Mr. Rod McNair sent a report from Manila. He was over there, arrived this past Thursday, and let's see, I guess that was Thursday a week ago. So he was over there. One sad note in the Philippines, one of our longtime ministers, Mr. Tex Benitez, died. He had been ill for a period of time and had evidently was suffering from liver damage due to a parasite. A lot of that sort of thing over there in the water and different things. And anyway, he did die February the 12th. And so please be remembering the Benitez family and the brethren there that he's been serving down on the island of Mindanao. Mr. Weston from Canada mentions that things are going well up there. There have been some business matters. One thing, we have our 800 number that is serviced by call centers. We have one in the U.S., we have one in Canada. The one that we had been working with in Canada has now gone out of business, and it appears we found another one. They have to be able to, we want somebody to get our calls live. We don't want people just calling in and getting a machine, because a lot of times folks just hang up. They don't want to talk to a machine. You know how well you like to talk to machines. So when you get first-time callers in, you'd like for them to talk to a real live human being. So anyway, that attendance in Canada is up about 1/3, about 34% over the January attendance over January of 2003. There's an Atlanta Singles Weekend. You can check the bulletin board for news on that, for the details, if that applies to you and you're interested. Mr. Bryce writes that he said, recently I had the opportunity and privilege to tour our congregations and offices in the Caribbean with Mr. Jonathan McNair, who served as the regional director for the Caribbean in addition to his responsibilities here. Mr. Bryce says, on January 31st, we had Sabbath services with our brethren in Jamaica. There were 98 warm and happy people in attendance. Mr. McNair, Mr. Hugh Wilson, and I ordained Mr. Selves Fraser as an elder in God's church. And then on Sunday, we drove to Negril, the northern part of the island, to make arrangements for holding the Feast of Tabernacles there. Then traveled to Barbados and held a Bible study there on Tuesday night with 32 in attendance. Baptized a young man the next day in the ocean. And then our next stop was in Guyana, where we had a Bible study on Thursday night with 15 present. Even though this is a poverty-stricken country, the brethren there are upbeat and dedicated. Our final stop was in Trinidad, where we held Sabbath services on February 7th with 62 in attendance. After we had a wonderful meal and fellowshipping and discussions. This congregation sings better than just about any I've ever heard, Mr. Bryce writes. Mr. McNair and I then went to Mr. and Mrs. Fitzroy Greenman's home, where our office is located, to watch the telecast at 4 p.m. The program was presented by Mr. Richard Ames, and before we'd even finished speaking, responses via phone calls started to come in one after another, and were continuing unabated when we left. Very encouraging to see firsthand on the front lines how God's work is surging forward in this part of the world. This was one of the most inspiring and unforgettable 10 days I've ever experienced. Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan McNair have done an outstanding job in the Caribbean region over the last 8 years. Mr. McNair's hard work, leadership, and long days away from his home and family, along with the cooperation and service of the brethren there, has all added up to much rich fruit being borne. Throughout this trip, I was reminded over and over again of what Ephesians 4 says, especially verses 15 and 16. Speaking the truth in love, we may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplies, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, makes increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. Well, brethren, I hope you really will be praying about our upcoming conference in Charlotte, that we're going to have well over 200 men and wives who are going to be coming in from around the world, from not only from the Caribbean and Latin America and Africa and Europe and Canada and, of course, across the United States, down in Australia, even in Southeast Asia, the Philippines. So there's going to be quite a representation there. Please pray for God's special inspiration and guidance, because ultimately, the only real success we're going to have is the success that comes from God. You and I have our part. But Paul explained it. He says, I've planted, Apollos watered, but God yields the increase. We have our responsibility and our part. But ultimately, God is the one who has to produce the real results, the real growth. And that's something certainly to be continuing to pray about and to go to God for. There are many things that we see going on in the world around us, and we realize that a lot of these things certainly do tie in very directly in terms of Bible prophecy. I don't know how many of you were aware or who had a chance to read or to listen to the Pope's New Year's Day message on the 1st of January. But he made some interesting statements. One of the interesting things that he said was that he spent part of the time discussing the American and British-led invasion of Iraq, and taking, of course, exception to that. And he says what the world needs is a new international order, drawing on the experience and the results of the United Nations. Oh, he's not talking about the UN. He's talking about a new international order. He's talking about something that draws from the experience of the UN. Well, what was the experience of the UN? They didn't want us to go in there, and we did. And so he wants something that's going to be a little more effective. I don't know if he'd been rereading Revelation 13 and Revelation 17 lately, or exactly what prompted him on some of those statements, but nevertheless, that's what he said. Often you and I, as we go through the Bible and we look at examples and we look at stories in there, haven't you ever thought sometimes how exciting it would have been to have lived back in Bible days? Oh, if you'd been there with Moses in the wilderness. Or maybe with Joshua when he came into the land. Or you'd been there with King David. Or at the time when Solomon dedicated the temple. Or maybe in the New Testament. Maybe with Peter and Paul and James and John. We look at that and say, boy, it would have been so exciting to have lived in Bible days. Well, brethren, I'm here to tell you, you and I are living in Bible days. We're living in the days that most of the prophecies in the Bible point to. Because the days we're living in are the prelude to the end of this age and the beginning of another. The days you and I are living in are the days the prophets of old wished that they could live in. You remember Daniel at the end of the book of Daniel? He was given this revelation to write down, and he did. But Daniel wanted to understand what all of that meant. He asked, he had an opportunity to ask the angel. The angel came, gave it to him. If you were there, wouldn't that have been your question? Well, how does all this fit? When's that going to happen? What does that mean exactly? Can you give me a few more details? And the angel told Daniel, you can read it in Daniel chapter 12. Go your way, Daniel. These things are sealed up until the time of the end. Daniel wanted to understand those things that he couldn't fully understand, things that you and I, frankly, can understand in more detail than even the one who wrote it down. Daniel would have liked to have been in our days. He would have liked to have seen the actual fulfillment of so many of those things that he wrote down and described. Now, we look at that, and we look at the times we're living in, and they're exciting times, and yet, brethren, one of the things that the Apostle Paul warns us of, he wrote to Timothy, he said, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come." Dangerous times. Perilous times shall come. And then he said, "Men shall be lovers of their own selves, disobedient, proud, blasphemers." He went on and he talked about various characteristics. He said the end times are dangerous times. So if you and I are living in the end time, as indeed we are, we're also living in perilous times, dangerous times. And one of the characteristics, in fact, the first characteristic that Paul mentioned, was men shall be lovers of their own selves. It will be a very self-focused, selfish, self-centered society. That'll characterize so much of the end time. And it's dangerous because it's very easy to get sucked in to that way of thinking, that way of responding to life. I want us to examine today some things that I think represent a very crucial area as we look at our lives, not only between now and Passover, but also our lives in the end of this age, recognizing that there are things that we're going to be tried and tested on. Let me ask you a question. If you were placed on trial, if you were arrested and placed on trial for being a Christian, would they be able to find enough evidence to get a conviction? What kind of evidence would they bring forward? What would they have to prove their case? Would the judge listen to the evidence and say, "I'm going to dismiss this case, you don't have any evidence. There's no basis for a charge against this man. You can't accuse him of being a Christian. You don't have any real evidence." Well, I tell you, that'd be one case you wouldn't want dismissed that way. Now, let's think a little bit about evidence. You know, when God made a covenant with Abraham, you read about it back in Genesis chapter 17. This occurred when Abraham, or Abram as he was at that time, was 99 years old. God appeared to him and he said, "I'm the Almighty God. I want you to walk before me, and I want you to be," the King James translates it, perfect. It means whole, complete, sincere. I don't want you double-minded. I want you whole, complete, sincere. I'm going to make my covenant between me and you, and I'm going to multiply you exceedingly. In fact, he said in verse 4, you're going to be a father of many nations. And one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to change your name to reflect that. No longer is your name going to be called Abram, but now you're going to be known as Abraham, the father of many nations. You ever thought about this occasion? You know, when God got through meeting with Abraham, he had a couple of announcements to make. So he had to call his household because God's talking to Abraham. But Abraham has servants. He has people born in his house. He's got a multitude of servants that he calls together, and he has a couple of announcements to make afterward. First announcement he makes, he said, you know, from now on, I'm to be known by a different name. I'm to be known as Father of a Multitude. Now here's a fellow 99. Doesn't have any kids. And he says, I've got good news. From now on, I'm to be known as Father of a Multitude. Well, they may, you know, people being people, you can see some of them sort of looking at one another and saying, yeah, sure. And he said, I've got some more news. I've been given a sign of that covenant. God has told me to circumcise myself. Okay, so far so good. And God said that I'm to circumcise all of you men too. Every man in my household. That's going to be a token of the covenant between me and you. Well, we're told that Abraham did this, that in fact, we're told in verse 22, when God went up from Abraham, verse 23, Abraham took Ishmael, and he took all that were born in his house and all that were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins in the same day. So he didn't lose any time. He was 99 years old when he was circumcised. Now, God made a covenant with Abraham. And that covenant involved a multitude of nations that would descend from Abraham. And circumcision was the sign of that covenant. You know what's interesting today? If you look around the world, you find that to this day, most of the descendants of Abraham still have that sign. The Arabs in the Middle East that descend from Ishmael, they're circumcised. The Turks that descend from Esau, they're circumcised as well. Of course, the Jews, those are the ones that are generally identified. They practice circumcision, as Abraham was told, right here on the 8th day. And you know, it's interesting when you look in the United States and you look in the English-speaking world, you look in northwestern Europe, you find that that's really the only area other than where we've talked about where circumcision is a common practice. So, to this day, that physical sign still is carried on and practiced by descendants of Abraham. God made Abraham, the father of many nations, made a covenant with him and gave a sign of the covenant. Now, several centuries later, some of Abraham's children, the children of Israel, or Jacob, of course, was Abraham's grandson. And the children of Israel, the descendants of Israel, were, as we pick up the story in the book of Exodus, they were in Egypt. They were slaves. God sent Moses, raised up Moses, to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. And so he brings Abraham's descendants out of Egypt, or this segment of Abraham's descendants, the ones through whom the promises are now going to be made, because with this branch of the family of Abraham, they arrive at Mount Sinai. The story is told in Exodus 19. They camp there at Mount Sinai. Moses goes up into the mountain to God, and God said, now look, Exodus 19:5, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, you will be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. You're going to be a kingdom of priests. You're going to be a holy nation. So God proposed a covenant with Israel there at Sinai that was based on their obedience, and that if they would obey him, if they would enter into that covenant and keep that covenant, he would make them a kingdom of priests. In Exodus 31, while Moses was in the mountain communing with God, after receiving the Ten Commandments, you know, God spoke the words of the Ten Commandments recorded in Exodus 20. Then Moses went up into the mountain to receive the 2 tablets of stone. In Exodus chapter 31, verse 12, the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, speak also unto the children of Israel, saying, truly, my Sabbaths you shall keep. It's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I'm the Lord that does sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, it's holy unto you. We find that the children of Israel, verse 16, are to keep the Sabbath, to observe it throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. So Moses was then given the 2 tables of testimony, the tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Verse 18. So circumcision was the sign of the covenant that God gave to Abraham. Now, God stresses here, as he's made the covenant with Israel at Sinai, that the Sabbath is a sign of their obedience to him and their relationship with him. Now, they continued with the sign of circumcision, but now they had another sign. Not that the Sabbath was new, that goes all the way back to creation week, but it is designated at this point as a sign of identification. It's to identify the entire nation of those who have a covenant with their Creator. You know, when we come to the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is basically laying out and discussing the terms of the new covenant. Now he makes plain in Matthew 5:17, don't think I've come to destroy the law of the prophets. I've not come to tear down the Torah. Rather, I've come to fulfill, to fill up to the full. That's what this word fulfill means. If you go through the Gospels, and you'll find one place where the word is used, refers to the disciples who had been they've been fishing, they've been casting their net, and it was empty. And Jesus told them to cast it on the other side. And we're told that they did. And the net was filled with fish to the point that it was about to break. Well, the word that's used there is the same word used here. The net filled with fish. That didn't mean Christ had abolished. That didn't mean that the net had been abolished, or the net had disappeared, or the net was somehow done away. It meant that it was filled up. It was filled up for the very purpose for which it existed. It was a net to catch fish, and it was filled full. In fact, it was so full they thought it was going to break. It didn't, but it had all it could be, all that could fit in it. Christ said, "I'm not come to destroy the law. I'm not come to tear it down. I've come to fill it up to the full, to pack in it everything that it was designed to contain." Just as that net was filled with everything that it was designed to contain. Couldn't hold any more. When Christ got through with the Torah, it was not going to be abolished. It was going to be filled so full that there would be nothing left to add in. So Christ didn't come to do away. He went on to say that in verse 20, "I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now, you know, the scribes and the Pharisees had the sign of circumcision that identified them as a child of Abraham. They prided themselves on that. The scribes and the Pharisees very carefully kept the Sabbath, which identified them as part of the covenant made with Israel. They viewed themselves as to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Christ said what they had wasn't enough. He didn't say what they were doing was bad. He said, your righteousness has to exceed theirs. What is it? Did you know that Jesus Christ added something? He added some of what you find right here in Matthew chapter 5, that that is there, that but let me show you something in terms of what Jesus told his disciples on his very final night with them as a human being. We're going to be rereading these scriptures in a matter of a few weeks, and when you have the Passover service, you'll be undoubtedly reading this that evening. We find that it was at the time of the Passover in John 13 that Jesus washed the disciples' feet. And at the conclusion of that time, in verse 14, he said, "If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I've given you an example that you should do as I've done to you." Then Christ went on to say, as we read the story of Judas getting up to leave during as the meal continued, Jesus said in verse 33 of John 13, "Little children, yet a little while I'm with you. You'll seek me, and as I said unto the Jews, where I go you cannot go, so now I say unto you, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. As I've loved you, that you shall also love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." You know, the sign of circumcision was an identifying sign to designate the descendants of Abraham, those who were participants in the covenant that God made with Abraham. And today, all who even spiritually participate in that covenant are spiritually circumcised, as we're told in Romans chapter 2, the very last couple of verses. Circumcision identifies those who were part of the covenant with Abraham. The Sabbath identifies those who have accepted the law of God, the commandments that God gave, entered into that covenant with God. It's a sign of obedience to the Creator. But you know, the scribes and the Pharisees bore those signs, but they were certainly not Christ's disciples, were they? Christ said, and understand, the 12 men that were sitting there in the room that he's talking to, all of them were circumcised, as God had instructed Abraham. All of them kept the Sabbath and had done so all their lives. There was nothing that Christ told them that made them think any of that was no longer to be done. But he said here on the final occasion with them, he said, I want you to understand something. I'm not taking away from the old, I'm adding something. And what I'm adding is the evidence by which all will know that you are my disciples. Because there are those who will bear signs of the covenant that God has made that are not truly my disciples. I've come not to destroy, not to tear down. I've come to fill up to the full. And the ultimate filling up is the very character and nature of God. The sign of discipleship. Jesus gave it to them there at the occasion of his final Passover. John records what Jesus said that night. John 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Notice in John chapter 15, in verse 12, Jesus said, this is my commandment, that you love one another, as I have loved you. Now, he didn't just say that you love one another. See, there was nothing really new about that. First, back in Leviticus 19:18, it says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. No, Jesus said, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I've loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. That a man lay down his life for his friends. Jesus said that we're to love one another with the kind of love that he himself had. The love of Christ in us. A sacrificial love. A love that is willing to give, to sacrifice. So Jesus went on, he emphasized that again in verse 17. These things I command you, that you love one another. You know, it's interesting as you look. Let me show you a couple of things that Luke preserved. Different of the authors of the New Testament and the authors of the Gospels preserved and emphasized different points of Jesus' message. One thing that Luke emphasizes is recorded in Luke chapter 23. In fact, Luke is the one who records this event about Jesus as he was being crucified. In Luke 23 and verse 34. We're told here in verse 33, when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, where they crucified him, the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left, then said Jesus, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. They parted his raiment and cast lots. Jesus set an incredible example. How do you feel when you're taken advantage of? How do you feel when somebody is hurting you or harming you? You know, it doesn't take too much to get most of us to, we really resent what this person said or did. Can you imagine how you would feel if you were, as Jesus was, arrested on false charges, beaten, now taken out, and you're going to be killed? Christ is put there. He's affixed to the stake. The soldiers down here, they're calloused to death. They're gambling over his clothes. It's this outer cloak, a part of his garments. Got this outer cloak. They start gambling over that because that's valuable, or it's an expensive garment and it's seamless. You destroy it to separate it. So they're sitting there shooting dice, seeing who will win his clothes. Pretty callous. Would your thought be what Christ's thought was? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't really grasp what they're doing. Well, let me show you something. Luke records that, and Luke also, in the book of Acts, tells you the story about Stephen. Stephen is the first Christian martyr. The first of the disciples of Jesus. One who probably was either baptized on the day of Pentecost or very, very shortly thereafter. Stephen was the first of Christ's disciples to be killed. You don't have the details of the death, the martyrdom of most of God's people, but you have the story of the first one. We're told that there was a young man who was standing there watching that, holding the coats of the people who threw stones at Stephen. His name was Saul. He heard something as he stood there and watched that he must have remembered. Because verse 59 of Acts 7, they stoned Stephen. And Stephen is calling upon God, saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And he kneeled down and he cried with a loud voice, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And then when he had said this, he fell asleep. The final thought that Stephen thought was, Father, forgive them. Lay not this sin to their charge. Stephen was a man who was filled with the Spirit of God. And in his death, he evidenced the same attitude that Jesus himself had had. Brethren, that's not an attitude that comes naturally. That's not part of the natural man. What Stephen said didn't come naturally. It came spiritually. It was not a reaction to the around. It was a response to the above. And there's a vast difference. When you and I bring forth the works of the flesh, we're reacting to the around. We're reacting to the stimuli of the society around. We're reacting to people and places and things. When we bring forth the fruits of the Spirit, you don't bring those forth as a reaction to what's around you. You bring them forth as a response to what is coming from above, the Spirit of God. Now let's look a little bit at the example that Jesus set. We see the example in his death, the example that he set at the very end of his life, an example emulated by Stephen, the very first of the Christians who were put to death for their faith. But Jesus Christ didn't just exemplify that. It's not just enough to say, well, yeah, when I die, that's going to be my last thought too. Goes beyond that. You see, Jesus Christ not only evidenced love in his death, he evidenced love in his life. He lived a life of giving and helping and serving. Now, it's easy to love some people. We all have people we love. It's easy to love some people because they're just nice folks. Maybe they've done something nice to you. They brought you something. They're always doing things for you and helping you, and boy, you just love them. Maybe you love your husband, love your wife. I hope so. Love your children. Grandkids are pretty easy to love. We love our parents. We love our friends. They're people that it's easy to love. Now, is that what Christ meant? He said, okay, I want you to look around and find folks that are just, lovable. And you can love those. But
what about some of the folks that aren't quite so lovable? You ever met any of those? You ever met anybody that was hard to love? You know, some of us can meet people that are hard to love just by looking in the mirror. At least there are probably others who think that way. You know, as Jesus was adding to the law and filling it up to the full, he said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43, "You have heard that it has been said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Now, it was said in the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor. Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the conclusion that many of the scribes and Pharisees drew from that, okay, you love your neighbor, but you hate your enemy. Now, hate your enemy is not, you can't quote chapter and verse on that. But that was what some people got out of it. You should love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. Jesus said, see, remember, what's he doing? He's filling up the Torah. Just like that net was filled with fish till it couldn't hold another fish. So Jesus is filling up the law till it can't hold anything more. Now, notice what he said. This is what you've heard, he tells them. But I say unto you, verse 44, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Now stop and think about that. If somebody is yelling curses at you, is the very first thing that pops into your mind is thinking about blessing them? Yeah, I think I'm going to go take them, some of my fresh tomatoes. No, maybe you may think about, letting them get overripe and throwing them at them. But those that hate you, do you feel like doing good to them? Those that despitefully use you, take advantage of it. Pray for them. Why should you do that? Verse 45, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain to the just and the unjust. God wants you to become just like him. You know what? How many people would there be on earth if everybody that cursed God, lightning strike hits them? Boy, they never got any rain. Sun never came up where they were. It was always black, cloudy day. Just hail and lightning. Well, we got a beautiful sunny day and the sky is blue. And it's shining on the folks that are out celebrating Mardi Gras. And it's shining on us. There's not going to be a hailstorm that just follows the parade route along and just pummels them. No, God makes the sun shine on the just and the unjust. The rain comes on the just and the unjust. If you love them which love you, what reward do you have? You're no different than anybody else. If you're nice to the people that are easy to be nice to, if you're nice to the people that are nice to you, you're in the same category with an awful lot of other folks. The publicans do the same. If you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. You know what God told Abraham way back? He said, Abraham, I want you to walk before me and be perfect. I want you to become like me. I want you to be wholehearted, complete, and sincere. Jesus came, and he starts filling up the law. And he says, why should you do this? Well, you need to do this because God wants you to become just like him. He doesn't want you to be just like everybody else. People who are up to no good can be friendly to each other. They do favors, Crooked politicians do favors for one another all the time. I'll be nice to you if you'll be nice to me. All sorts of folks do deals with one another. It's easy to love people who are being nice and kind and friendly, and they just always leave you feeling good and smile on your face. You like to see them come. How do you feel about people that aren't that way? You hold a resentment, harbor a grudge. One of the troubles with resentments and grudges is that the one they harm the most, the one they eat on, is the one that's holding on to them. You get up every morning and you're just in a sour attitude because of old so-and-so and what a rotten guy he is and all the dirt he's done to you. Whose day are you spoiling, yours or his? You know, you're getting up and boy, you're mad. And he's going on about his business. No, God wants us to become like Him. And Christ picked a sign. He said, this is the sign, this is the evidence by which all men shall know that you're my disciples. Now, let's look at that. Let's look a little bit at Jesus' own personal example during His lifetime, because we see it's easy sometimes to love people that are lovable. Sometimes we love people who are like us. You know, their personality is such, we just click with them. And we all have people like that, don't we? People you just sort of click with and you just enjoy being with them. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. The trouble most of us run into, though, is, of course, everybody doesn't just click. Now, let's notice something here in John chapter 11, in verse 1. Now, a certain man was sick. His name was Lazarus. Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped His feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sister sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. That was the way they described their brother. Jesus just really loved their brother. When Jesus heard that, He said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified thereby. Notice now verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Jesus loved the whole family. Now, with that in mind, let's turn back to Luke's account and let's read of an earlier incident that Luke records, because this one that John records is right toward the end of Jesus' ministry, just a matter of maybe 6 weeks or so, no more than 2 months before Passover, the final Passover of Jesus' ministry. But let's go back to an account that Luke records in Luke chapter 10 that occurred at a much earlier time in Jesus' ministry. Luke chapter 10 and verse 38. Now it came to pass, as they went, that he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. She had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard His words. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to Him and said, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to come out here and help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, you are careful and troubled about many things. One thing is needful, and Mary has chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now, Mary and Martha were very different. Martha was one of these people who was organized. She had invited Jesus and the 12 disciples over for dinner. She's got a meal to get on the table for 15 people. Now, that's a pretty good job. Some of you ladies, all of a sudden have 15 folks show up, counting the family. 15 folks show up, you've got to get dinner on the table. You're hustling around. Martha's organized, and she is working. She is careful about everything. She likes it just lined up, just so. She's got her schedule. She's got the whole thing mapped out. She looks around, and where is her sister, who's supposed to be in there helping? Well, she goes out there, and here's her sister sitting out there where the men are, and her sister sitting there at Jesus' feet and listening to what He's saying. He's talking and explaining. You can just see Martha standing at the door. Lord, would you please tell my sister to get up and get out here and help me get this food on the table? I can't believe it. She left me to do all this stuff. You ever known anybody like Martha? Organized, hustle, bustle, let's get it all done. We've got to be on time. Everything's got to be running like clockwork. How exasperated. Do you think this is the first time in her life Martha ever got exasperated with Mary? Mary is a very different person than Martha. She's a lot more thoughtful and intuitive, very emotional person. She's the one that, in John's account, he says she's the one that came in and poured this ointment on Jesus' feet, worth the equivalent of a few $1,000s. Not only did some of the disciples think it was a waste, I dare say that practical Martha Well, I can't believe what Mary is doing. Mary was a very different person. Now, you know, some of us would really click with Martha. We'd like to be working with Martha on organizing a potluck. Boy, everything would be lined up and run efficiently. Some of you wouldn't enjoy working with Martha. But you'd like Mary. You just really identify with Mary. The point that John makes in John 11, he says, Jesus loved Martha. And he loved Mary. And he loved Lazarus. Jesus loved all three of them. Very different personalities. Jesus loved them all. Loved each of them. He loved them and valued them for what they were. And you know, there were things that each of them had to learn. Martha was practical, and there's certainly a very important role for practical people. But you know, at the specific time when Martha came in there so exasperated because Mary wasn't out in the kitchen helping her get dinner on the table, where was Mary? She was sitting at the feet of the Son of God, soaking up what he was saying. Now, is that such a bad thing? You know, there are going to be a lot of opportunities to get dinner on the table. But there are not going to be a whole lot of opportunities to sit at the very feet of the Son of God and to listen to what he has to say. Jesus said, you know, for once, Mary's actually chosen the better course. She has latched onto something that is more important than what you're doing because, you know, I know everybody's hungry and dinner's important. But if you understood how important the words of life were that I was saying, you would realize that Mary has actually made a better choice. You know, look at some of the disciples that Jesus called. Remember, let me call your attention to something in John 13. And then we're going to look at some of the disciples. John 13, verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, and that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, and he loved them unto the end. Jesus loved his own. He loved them unto the end. All of them sitting there. He was getting ready to wash their feet. And he looked around at those men and he loved them to the end. And you know what that meant? Well, it meant that he loved impetuous Peter. You know, a few hours later, John records in John chapter 18, the soldiers showed up to arrest Jesus. John 18:10, Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and he smote the high priest's servant, and he cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And Jesus said unto Peter, put up your sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father has given me, shall I not drink it? Now, all of the different gospel accounts give you a little bit of information on this. John is the one who tells you actually who it was. Yeah, that was Peter. That's sort of who you'd expect. You know, you read through the story, and nearly every time anything was said, first guy that popped up with an answer was Peter. Always, hey, you know, let's do this, let's go there. Impetuous Peter, always quick. In one case, you remember the case of the Transfiguration? They described the Transfiguration. And Peter piped up and said, let's build 3 tabernacles. Now, one of the gospel accounts adds in the fact that Peter said this because he didn't know really what to say. Some people, if they don't know what to say, keep their mouth shut. Peter, if he didn't know what to say, well, he just went ahead and said something. Here on the night of the final Passover, Jesus has just gotten through talking about love. Peter grabs a sword and goes after a guy. He's ready to skewer him like a shish kebab. He didn't just, try to nick his ear. He went for his head. The guy dodged, and he just, sort of cut his ear. Ear falls to the ground. Jesus picks up the ear and heals the man. Jesus loved impetuous Peter. Called him. Worked with him. Some of you, as you read the story about Peter, some of you may really identify with Peter. And there are others of you who would find Peter, if you had been around him, you'd have found Peter a pretty hard fellow to love. He was always jumping into things. He was always, getting stirred up, ready to do this, ready to pop off here, ready to do that. Always quick with an answer. May not be the right answer. Sometimes it was, but sometimes it was completely off the wall. Jesus was at one time explaining about how he was going to be taken and crucified, and Peter piped up and said, "Oh, Lord, don't even talk about that. I won't let that happen to you." No, that's not going to happen. We won't let that happen. Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't really savor the things of God, do you?" Jesus loved impetuous Peter. I'll tell you something else. He loved pushy, judgmental James and John. You ever thought about James and John as how pushy they were, how quick to judge, jump to conclusions and make judgmental comments? What about back in Mark chapter 3? You read the account of, in Mark 3:14, Jesus ordained 12. And in verse 17, we find these included James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James. And Jesus surnamed them Boanerges, which means the sons of thunder. He gave them a nickname. They were old thunder and lightning. The sons of thunder. Come on over in Mark's account a little later, Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, verse 38. Jesus is here talking about in verse 35, "If any man desire to be first, the same shall be last and the servant of all. He took a child, set it in the midst, and said, you have to receive such children. If you receive one of these children in my name, you receive me." Verse 38, John piped up and he said, "Master, we saw somebody casting out demons in your name, and he followed us not, and we forbade him because he followed us not." John said, "I saw somebody over there and I told him to quit." Who put John in charge and told him to go tell him to quit? Well, nobody. John saw him doing it and he said, "You quit that. You don't have any right to do that. Who do you think you are? You're not with us. You can't do that." I guess when he brought it up to Jesus, he figured he'd get a pat on the back and Jesus would say, "Hey, want to go? You go around and tell everybody else to quit all the things they're doing too." Jesus said, "Don't be doing that. Don't forbid him to do something like that. There's no man that'll do a miracle in my name that can lightly speak evil of me." You come on over here, the next chapter, Mark chapter 10. Verse 32. They were in the way going up to Jerusalem, from Galilee going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus went before them, and they were amazed. And so he says, "We're going up to Jerusalem." Verse 33, the Son of Man's going to be delivered to the chief priests. Verse 34, they're going to mock him and scourge him, spit on him, kill him. Verse 35, here Jesus is having this heartfelt conversation, telling them what's going to happen. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him, sort of got him off where they didn't think the others would hear. And they said, "Master, we got a request. We got something we'd like to ask you." He said, what would you like for me to do?" They said, "Grant unto us that we may sit, one on your right hand, the other on your left, in your glory." Boy, we'd like to be at the top. We'd like to be in charge. One of us will take the right hand and the other the left. We'll be right there with you. We'd like to be in charge, right under you. Jesus said, "You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink of and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, we can do that." And Jesus said, "Well, you're going to drink of the cup that I drink of, and the baptism that I'm baptized, will you be baptized? But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give. It'll be given to them for whom it's prepared." Notice verse 49. When the 10 heard it, they began to be much displeased with James and John. Boy, were they mad when they found out these guys have been off over here trying to maneuver in. They wanted to be number one and number two. One of the other gospel accounts shows that on another occasion they got their mother in on the act. Would you say a little bit judgmental, a little bit pushy? I saw him over here doing this. I told him to quit it. Hey, I'd like to be number one, right under you. I'd like to be your right-hand man. A little bit judgmental, a little bit pushy. Luke mentions an interesting case. Luke chapter 9 gives you a little more insight.
Luke chapter 9. Verse 51. Came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. He sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, Lord, you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just like Elijah did? He turned and rebuked them. He said, you don't know what manner of spirit you're of. Their first response, let's just nuke them. Let's call down fire. Just burn it up. Oh, that'll show them. Who do those guys think they are? Let's just burn them up. You know what Jesus did? He went to another village. Verse 56. He just said, hey, we don't have to eat here. We're just going down to the next village. You know, you think James and John were just always the most lovable of folks? Now, maybe you really identify with that personality, but some of you may, but some of you surely don't. James and John, a little bit pushy, a little quick-tempered, hot-headed. Jesus nicknamed them lightning and thunder. You know, the sons of thunder. But you know what? We're going to come back a little bit later as to some of what they learned. Let's look at another case. Let's go back to John chapter 1. Jesus loved impetuous Peter. He loved pushy, judgmental James and John. John chapter 1, we read the story of how Jesus, some of his disciples first became acquainted with him. You read about Andrew and Peter. And you find that we read about Philip, who was a neighbor to Peter and Andrew. It's mentioned in verse 44. Now Philip, when he's introduced to Jesus, verse 45, Philip goes and finds Nathanael. And he said unto him, we found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nathanael said, can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? Philip said, come see. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and he said, behold, an Israelite in whom is no guile. You know, Jesus loved blunt Nathanael. An Israelite in whom there's no guile. You never had to worry what Nathanael was thinking. He just blatted out. Philip said, hey, I want to come and show you the Messiah. We found the one that all the prophecies point to, Jesus of Nazareth. Nathanael said, I don't believe it. I don't think much of folks that come from Nazareth. If any good thing come out of Nazareth, I never heard anything good come from up there. You know, Nathanael had an opinion. And he was not one of these shy guys who just sort of never let you know what he was thinking. Jesus saw him and he said, well, I see you're an Israelite in whom is no guile. Not a subtle bone in your body. But you know, Jesus loved impetuous Peter and judgmental John, and he loved old blunt Nathanael. And you know what? When you get on back to John chapter 20, we find somebody else he loved. He loved old doubting Thomas. You know, Thomas was not a natural optimist. Nobody ever accused Thomas of being the founder of the Optimist Club. You know, one of the places you read about Thomas is back in John 11 when Jesus was going to go up to Bethany where Lazarus was sick. And then we find that Jesus was talking about going up there in John 11:7. He said to his disciples, let's go into Judea again. And his disciples said, well, Lord, you know, last time we were up there, the Jews tried to kill you. And Jesus went and explained to them why it was important they had to go up and raise Lazarus. And so old Thomas piped up in verse 16, and he said to his fellow disciples, well, let us go also. We may die with him. Well, you know, not a good idea, boy. I figure we'll all get killed. Well, if he's going to get killed, I guess we might as well. We'll just all die. Real optimistic sort of fellow. Always looked on the bright side. Back in John chapter 20,
you find Jesus appeared to the disciples after the resurrection. But John 20, verse 24 tells us that Thomas, one of the 12, was not with them. And the other disciples, when they saw him, they said, "We've seen the Lord." Thomas said, "I don't believe it. Except I see the nail prints in his hand, and I put my finger into the print of the nails, and I thrust my hand into his side where that spear went. I'm not going to believe it. I don't believe it. I saw the dead body. I don't believe it." Well, a week later, they were all there. Thomas was with them. Jesus just suddenly appeared in the midst. He said, "Peace be unto you." And he looked over at Thomas, verse 27, and he said, "Here, reach out your finger. I want you to touch my hand. In fact, bring your whole hand. I want you to thrust it into my side. Stick it in there. Stick it in the hole. Don't be faithless, but believing." And Thomas answered, and he said unto him, "My Lord and my God." You know, doubting Thomas didn't stay doubting Thomas. But Jesus loved him even when he was. Because remember, John 13:1, we read, He loved them all. He loved them unto the end. He loved Peter when he was impetuous. He loved John even when he was quick-tempered and judgmental. Loved Thomas even when he was doubting Thomas. Now you go through the story and you find they didn't all stay that way. You know, Jesus impacted their life. Peter, how many times do you think Peter in his mind thought back over the events of that final night with Jesus? You know, he talks about it in 1 Peter 2. 1 Peter 2:20, he said, "What glory is it if when you're buffeted for your faults you take it patiently?" What's the claim? What benefit is that? Verse 21, "Even hereunto were you called, because Christ suffered for us, setting us an example, that you should follow in his steps. He didn't do any sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, committed himself to him that judges righteously. His own self bore our sins in the tree. Being dead to sin, we should live unto righteousness." You know, Peter thought back. Do you think Peter thought about the contrast in the reaction that Jesus had that night and the one Peter had? Peter's reaction was to grab his sword and go after the guy. Jesus' first response was to reach down, pick up the ear, and heal it. Peter, writing 30 years later, had a lot of time to reflect on that. And one of the things Peter reflected on was that his natural response, his first reaction, was very, very different from Jesus' first response. Peter had a lot of time to think about that, and he said, you know, he set us an example. That's not the way I reacted. That was not the response that came to my mind. You know, Peter, when he was reviled, he was ready to revile again. It struck him that evening. Jesus didn't do that. You know, what about John? You know, nobody wrote more on the subject of love than John did. John, of course, is writing about 60 years after the events of Christ's crucifixion. John is an old man. He's had a lot of time to think about certain things. Think about how pushy and judgmental he was. You know, John grew. Notice here in 1 John, a letter that the Apostle John wrote near the end of his life. In 1 John chapter 2. You know, John starts out in chapter 1 by talking about the ability in the whole purpose for which he writes the letter of 1 John, really. 1 John chapter 1, verse 3. "That which we've seen and heard declare we unto you, that you may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ." God is building a family. And families have relationships. Healthy families have healthy relationships. You can't have healthy relationships
without love and trust. The family of God is going to dwell together in peace and harmony forever. John says, I'm writing these things. I'm telling you the things that we saw and heard. I'm an eyewitness. I know what I'm talking about. And I say that so that you might have fellowship with us, and that truly our fellowship is with the Father and with Jesus Christ. Now, going on in John chapter 2, in verse 8, he says, again, a new commandment I write unto you. You know, John is the one who describes that new commandment back in John. We read back in John 13. He said, a new commandment I write unto you, that which thing is true in him and in you, because the darkness is past and the true light now shines. He that says he's in the light and hates his brother is in darkness, even until now. He that loves his brother abides in the light. There's none occasion of stumbling in him. He that hates his brother is in darkness and walks in darkness, knows not where he goes. The darkness has blinded his eyes. You know, why is it important to love your brother? Well, you can't abide in the light. If you hate your brother, then you're abiding in darkness, and God's in the light, and so you can't have fellowship with God if you're not where He is. He's in the light, and in Him is no darkness at all. So if you're going to have fellowship with Him, you've got to be in the light also. But if hatred, resentment is in your heart, then it darkens your heart. You're dwelling in darkness. And you can't dwell in darkness and walk with God at the same time. You can't have fellowship with God and dwell in the darkness. So John says, this is important. This is why I'm explaining this. He goes on and explains a little more. 1 John chapter 4, verse 2. Well, let's look a little earlier in 1 John. 1 John chapter 4. And let's look in verse 11. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Verse 10 says, herein is love, not that we love God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. If God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. God didn't love us because we were just so lovable. You know, the remarkable thing is not that we love God, but that He loved us. And God showed us how much He loved us by giving His Son to be payment for our sins. If He so loved us, we also ought to love one another. You see, you can't separate the love of God. You can't separate the love of God from the love of the brethren. You know, why do we love God? Or why are we to love one another? Well, we can't abide in the light if we don't abide in love. We're to have the evidence of the very attitude and nature of God. Let's look up here in John chapter 4 and verse 2. Hereby know you the Spirit of God. It talks about the Spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ is come, or is coming, literally, in the flesh, is of God. That's Jesus Christ comes into us to live His life over in us. Verse 7, Beloved, let us love one another. Love is of God, and everyone that loves is begotten of God and knows God. Well, that's why it's important to love, because it's an evidence of being God's child. You know God. If you don't think like God thinks, you don't know God. Not really. You may know about Him, but you don't know Him. You know, Amos says, familiar scripture, can two walk together lest they be agreed? You can't walk with God and have fellowship with God unless you agree with Him. If you don't agree with God, then you won't have fellowship with Him, because He's going to be here and you're going to be over there. Verse 9, and this was manifested the love of God toward us, because that God sent His only begotten Son into the world that we might live through Him. Herein is love, not that we love God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No man has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God dwells in us, and His love is perfected in us. It's God's love in you that is to flow out toward others. You see, the kind of love that is just natural. It's natural to like people that do nice things for you. But what you and I are called to do is to go beyond that, to have the kind of love that Christ had, the love of God in us. Verse 13, hereby know we that we dwell in Him and He in us, because He's given us of His Spirit. That's how you know. Verse 15, whoever shall confess that Jesus is the Son of God, God dwells in Him and He in God. We've known and believed the love that God has to us. God is love. He that dwells in love dwells in God, and God in Him. Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment, that as He is, so are we in this world. We're trying to live our lives in this world just like Jesus Christ lived. Verse 19, we love Him because He first loved us. If a man say, I love God, and hates his brother, he's a liar. He that loves not his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he's not seen? This commandment have we from Him, that he who loves God love his brother also. How do you do that? How do you actually evidence that kind of love? Well, 1 John 3 tells us, 1 John 3:16 says, hereby perceive we the love of God, because He laid down His life for us. We ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Whoso has this world's good and sees his brother have need and shuts up his bowels of compassion, how dwells the love of God in him? My little children, let's not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. You see, the kind of love that he's talking about is a love that is evidenced in deed. It's love in truth. It's not just saying the words, oh, I love everybody. That's all well and good. It's not enough to pay lip service to it. You see, if it's real, Jesus Christ is truly living in us, then it's going to be evidenced. One of the ways it's evidenced, he says, how do we perceive the love of God? Well, because of what He did for us. How do you grasp, how do you understand that God loves you? Well, look what He did for you. He gave His only begotten Son. Christ laid down His life for us. Well, how would other people perceive our love for them? Well, if we lay down our lives for the brethren. That's not just talking about dying. It's also talking about living, a living sacrifice. For instance, he gives an illustration. If you have what you need and somebody else is in need, and you shut up the bowels of compassion, how dwells the love of God in you? You see somebody in need and, he's hungry and you got enough to eat and you keep yours and don't give him any. Is that love? That's not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. You remember the parable of the Good Samaritan, very familiar section in Scripture. But think about what prompted it. One of the lawyers, one of the students of the Torah, an expert, a teacher in the law, came to Jesus and he said, I've got a question for you. What is the most important thing in the Torah? What's the most important law? And Jesus said, well, you're a teacher of the law. You're supposed to be an expert. I'd like to find out if you know the answer. What do you think is the most important thing in the law? The lawyer answered. First he quoted from Deuteronomy. He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. That's the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it. Then he quoted Leviticus 16:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, that's right. That's exactly right. If you do that, you'll live. Very interesting, the lawyer's response. We're told, but he, willing to justify himself, said, and just who exactly is my neighbor? Define neighbor. Jesus told him a story. He said, I've got a story I want to tell you. Told him the story of the Good Samaritan. A fellow who was heading up to Jerusalem, and he was caught and beat up and left laying by the side of the road, robbed. A priest came by and a Levite came by. You know, neither the priest nor the Levite, if you had asked them, would have said the law of God is done away. Oh, they believed in the law. If you'd asked them, do you believe in the law? Well, sure. They were on their way to Jerusalem. I'm a priest. I'm a Levite. Of course I do. You know what? If you'd asked the priest and the Levite the question Jesus asked the lawyer, I dare say they'd have given the same answer. They knew the answer. They were experts. They could have quoted the same verses. If you had asked them, do you believe Leviticus 18:19 or 19:18? Do you believe that statement? Oh, yes, I believe everything written in the law. But they didn't stop and help, did they? See, the interesting thing it says about the Samaritan, who probably didn't know and understand as much as the priest and Levite knew from a technical standpoint. After all, he was a Samaritan. But you know what? It said when the Samaritan saw the poor fellow laying by the side of the road, he was moved with compassion. See, what he had that they didn't have was compassion. It's not enough to know the truth. It's not just enough to know it. Paul explains that in Hebrews. He says the gospel was preached to them as well as unto us, talking about the children of Israel that came out of Egypt. The gospel was preached to them as well as unto us, but it didn't profit them. Not being mixed with faith in them that heard it, it did not profit them. You know, you've seen maybe cans in the supermarket of like powdered lemonade. All you got to do is add water and stir. Well, the truth is like that. You got to add faith and stir. Not enough just to have the truth. Not enough just to know the right answers. You got to believe it. You got to believe it from the heart. It changes your life when you really believe it from the heart. When you go through and you read 1 John, you realize that the man that wrote that was not the same judgmental, pushy fella that he had been 60 some odd years earlier, when he was charging around telling people to stop when he had no business. Nobody told him, put him in charge of that. When he was trying to get Jesus off and maneuver into number one spot. When he was ready to call down fire, just burn up these folks, get rid of them. You know, the young man, and Jesus loved him when he was pushy, judgmental young John. He loved him. Loved him right up to the end. He loved old impetuous Peter even when he was impetuous Peter, ready to grab a sword and go after somebody. When Peter wrote 30 some odd years later, Peter talked about Jesus' example in that final night. And he said, you know, in effect, he said the way he handled it was so totally different than the way I wanted to handle it. When he was reviled, he didn't revile again. Couldn't get over that. 30 some odd years later, he was still thinking about it, meditating on it. He said he left us an example. He left us an example that we should follow in his steps. You know, the thing to understand is